My father secretly called every major construction company in town and told them I was a thief. For over 3 years, no one would hire me. He sneered that I would end up coming back to serve the family. From a top architecture student who graduated at the very top of my class, I was forced to wait tables just to afford my basic rent. Last week, I finally got a real interview at a massive firm. The chief executive officer walked in and studied me for a long moment. Then he pulled out a file that made the entire room go silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family that tried to destroy your future. The air inside the restaurant was heavy with the scent of roasted garlic and expensive champagne. It was a Friday night in the most exclusive dining establishment in all of Atlanta. I wore a stiff white button-down shirt and a black apron wiping down a marble table until it reflected the warm light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. For 3 years, this had been my reality. I was 26 years old, and my hands, which possessed the talent to draft structural marvels, were reduced to scrubbing away crumbs left behind by the city elite. I had learned to make myself invisible, navigating the dining room with quiet efficiency. The heavy glass doors at the front entrance swung open, and the temperature in the room immediately felt 10 degrees colder. I froze with the cleaning cloth still in my hand. Walking through the doors was my father, Desmond. He was the chief executive officer of our family real estate empire, wearing a custom charcoal suit that commanded absolute authority. Beside him walked my mother, Valerie, dripping in pearls and judging the hostess before a single word was even spoken. Trailing right behind them was my older sister, Kendra, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life, wearing a silk dress that easily cost 3 months of my rent. And finally, there was Brad, my sister's white husband, who served as the chief financial officer of my father company. Brad had a habit of using subtle condescension to remind me of my place. They were here to celebrate a massive victory. I knew all about it because their faces had been plastered on every local business magazine all week long. Kendra had just been publicly appointed as the lead architect for the waterfront project, which was a highly anticipated $2 billion development. The bitter truth that burned in my chest was that I had created the original conceptual design for that exact project. I had poured my entire soul into those blueprints before my father framed me for embezzling $500,000 and threw me out of his house. I turned my head and prayed the hostess would seat them on the opposite side of the restaurant. But my father possessed eyes like a hawk. He spotted me standing near the service station, and a slow, calculated smile spread across his face. He leaned over and whispered something to the maitre d' while pointing directly at my section. He wanted to parade his newly secured wealth in front of the daughter he had deliberately ruined. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I smoothed my black apron, picked up my leather serving book, and walked over to their table. The moment I arrived, the lively conversation among them came to a dead halt. Valerie looked me up and down, with an expression of sheer pity mixed with disgust, as if the very fabric of my uniform offended her. Desmond leaned back in his tufted leather chair and crossed his arms, looking at me like I was a conquered enemy. "Good evening," I said, keeping my voice completely steady and professional. "Welcome to our restaurant. May I start you all off with some sparkling water or a bottle of our vintage wine?" Brad let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed slightly in the quiet dining room. "Look at you, Zuri," he said, while shaking his head in mock sympathy. "Serving water to the people who matter. It really is a tragedy. If only you had made better choices, you could be sitting right here at this table celebrating with us instead of taking our drink orders." I refused to look at him, keeping my eyes politely fixed on the center of the table. Kendra tossed her long hair over her shoulder and smiled with dripping sweetness. "Oh, let her do her job, Brad," she said, while resting her hand on his arm. "Someone has to bring us our expensive champagne tonight. We have a $2 billion deal to toast to. After all, I am the new lead architect now. It takes a monumental amount of talent to design something that grand." The sheer audacity of her claiming my stolen intellectual property as her own made my blood boil, but I kept my face blank. I poured their water with perfectly steady hands, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break under their pressure. For the next 2 hours, I was subjected to a psychological torture session disguised as a fine dining experience. Every single time I approached the table to serve a new course or clear a plate, my father made sure to speak loudly about the waterfront development. He boasted about the Wall Street investors they had successfully secured and the massive profits they were anticipating. He praised Kendra for her brilliant architectural mind, calling her a visionary. Valerie chimed in, continuously agreeing that Kendra was the absolute pride of the family and the perfect representation of Black excellence. Every word they spoke was a calculated strike, meant to remind me of exactly what I had lost and exactly who had taken it from me. But I had spent 3 long years building an impenetrable fortress around my emotions. I served their expensive caviar. I refilled their vintage champagne glasses. I cleared their empty plates with the precision and silent grace of a ghost. I did not speak unless I was spoken to, and I never let my polite customer service smile waver even for a fraction of a second. Dessert was finally finished, and the tension at the table was reaching a dangerous boiling point simply because I refused to react to their bait. Desmond was growing visibly irritated that his psychological warfare was not producing any tears or begging from me. He exchanged a dark look with Brad. Brad nodded very slightly and reached toward his nearly full glass of red wine. As I stepped forward to clear the final dessert plates from the table, Brad deliberately swung his elbow out. His arm caught the heavy base of the wine glass, sending a cascade of dark crimson liquid flying aggressively across the table. The dark red wine splashed violently, ruining the pristine white tablecloth and completely staining the edge of Kendra's expensive silk dress. Kendra shrieked at the top of her lungs, jumping up from her chair and swatting at her ruined garment in absolute horror. "What is wrong with you?" Brad yelled, slamming his fist hard on the table and pointing his finger directly at my face. "You clumsy waitress! You knocked my glass right into my wife." The entire restaurant went dead silent. Diners at all the nearby tables turned their heads in shock to watch the sudden commotion. The soft jazz music playing through the overhead speakers suddenly felt entirely too loud. I stood perfectly still, holding my silver serving tray against my side. I had not been within 2 feet of his glass when it fell. We both knew he had knocked it over himself on purpose, but the truth did not matter to men like Brad. What mattered to him was power and the ability to humiliate someone who could not fight back. "I cannot believe this," Valerie gasped, grabbing a cloth napkin and dabbing frantically at Kendra's ruined dress. "This beautiful dress is completely ruined. You are absolutely useless, Suri. You have always been a walking disaster." Brad stood up from his chair, towering over me with his chest puffed out. His face was flushed with manufactured outrage meant for the audience of wealthy diners watching us. "It is no wonder you got blacklisted from the entire architecture industry," he sneered, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet dining room. "You cannot even clear a simple table without causing a massive catastrophe. You are a complete failure. You do not belong in a place like this or anywhere near our family. Get me your manager right now." I did not argue with him. I did not attempt to defend myself against his lies. I knew exactly how this power game was played. I turned around and walked calmly to the back of the house to fetch the restaurant manager. When the manager arrived at the table, my father and Brad put on an award-winning performance of outrage. They demanded that the entire meal be comped. They demanded that I be disciplined immediately for my supposed incompetence. They spoke about me as if I were useless trash that deserved to be thrown out. The manager was desperate to appease such wealthy and highly influential patrons, so he apologized profusely and promised to handle the situation immediately. When it came time to finally pay the bill, Desmond waved the manager away and insisted on settling the tab with me directly. The total for their lavish meal was over $2,000. He pulled out a thick silver money clip and peeled off a stack of crisp $100 bills, tossing them onto my silver tray one by one. He made sure I watched every single bill fall onto the metal surface. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy black pen. He picked up a clean white cloth napkin and scrawled a message on it, pressing hard into the fabric. He placed the folded napkin onto the tray and dropped a single crumpled $5 bill right on top of his handwritten message. "Keep the change," he said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. My family stood up, smoothing their expensive clothes and adjusting their sparkling jewelry. They walked out of the restaurant like untouchable royalty, leaving behind a massive mess for the peasants to clean up. I stood at the empty table, looking down at the silver tray in my hands. There were $2,000 to cover the meal and a pathetic $5 tip for 3 hours of flawless service and targeted public humiliation. I picked up the crumpled $5 bill and read the words my father had written on the napkin in sharp black ink. Come back and fetch coffee for your sister, or serve tables for the rest of your life. Your choice, thief. He wanted me entirely broken. He wanted me to crawl back to his corporate office on my hands and knees begging for a minimum wage assistant job just to escape the grinding poverty he had forced me into. He wanted me to watch my sister build a massive empire using my stolen genius while I withered away in his shadow forever. I looked at the napkin in my hand. Then I looked at the heavy glass doors where my family had just exited into the cool Atlanta night. I did not shed a single tear over their cruelty. I did not feel the crushing despair they were so desperately hoping to see. Instead, a slow, icy calm washed over my entire body, settling deep into my bones. I folded the napkin very carefully and placed it into my black apron pocket. I took the $5 bill and left it sitting alone on the ruined table. My father thought he was the smartest man in any room he entered. He thought his vast wealth and unchecked power made him completely untouchable by someone like me. But he was blinded by his own massive arrogance. He had no idea that tomorrow morning my entire life was going to change forever, and his carefully constructed house of cards was going to come crashing down in a way he could never anticipate. I took off my apron, threw it over the back of a wooden chair, and walked out of the dining room completely ready to face the destiny that was waiting for me. The restaurant manager was waiting for me near the swinging doors of the kitchen, his face pale and covered in a thin sheen of nervous sweat. He had been watching the entire interaction from the safety of the hallway, and he knew exactly who my family was. He wrung his hands together, holding my final paycheck in a small white envelope. He did not even look me in the eye when he spoke. He just stared at the floor and mumbled that Brad had made a formal complaint to the regional director. He said my family was too powerful in the Atlanta business scene, and the restaurant simply could not afford the bad press that would come from crossing the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar real estate empire. He apologized repeatedly, telling me I was the best server they had, but his hands were tied. I took the white envelope from his trembling fingers and nodded. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I calmly walked to the employee locker room, untied my black apron, and placed it neatly on the wooden bench. I gathered my few belongings into my bag and walked out the back door into the cool night air. The heavy metal door clicked shut behind me, severing my ties to the service industry forever. As I walked toward the bus stop, the humid Atlanta breeze washed over my face. I should have felt devastated. I had just lost my only source of income, and I had exactly $42 left in my checking account. But as I stood under the flickering yellow streetlight waiting for the late-night bus, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. My father thought he had delivered the final crushing blow meant to break my spirit completely. Instead, he had just severed the very last string of fear that was holding me back. Tomorrow morning I had an interview that would dictate the rest of my life, and I was ready. The next morning the sun rose bright and harsh over the Atlanta skyline. I woke up at 5 o'clock in my cramped studio apartment. I ironed my only professional suit, a dark navy ensemble I had found at a thrift store, and carefully tailored by hand until it fit my frame perfectly. I pulled my hair back into a sleek low bun, making sure not a single strand was out of place. I gathered my leather portfolio containing years of my architectural designs, structural calculations, and urban planning concepts. I took the city bus to the affluent Buckhead district, stepping off onto the pristine sidewalks that were lined with towering corporate glass buildings. I walked toward the headquarters of Sterling Architecture. It was a massive, striking building constructed entirely of steel and dark-tinted glass. It stood in direct defiance to my father's traditional brick and heavy marble empire. Sterling Architecture was the biggest rival my family had in the city. They were known for bold, modern designs and ruthless business tactics. The founder and chief executive officer was a man named Sterling, a highly respected and deeply feared figure in the industry. Getting an interview with him was nearly impossible, but I had submitted a complex urban redesign proposal directly to his private executive email. My work had spoken for itself, and his office had called me the very next day. I walked through the revolving glass doors and approached the front desk. The lobby was vast and intimidating, echoing with the quiet hum of immense wealth. The receptionist checked my name and immediately directed me to the private executive elevator. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs as the elevator shot up to the top floor. The doors slid open, revealing a sweeping executive suite with panoramic views of the entire city. An assistant led me down a long hallway and opened the heavy oak door to the corner office. Mr. Sterling sat behind a massive desk made of reclaimed wood and brushed steel. He was a distinguished black man in his mid-50s with sharp, observant eyes that seemed to analyze every single movement I made. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, and his posture projected absolute authority. The room was completely silent. I walked in and stood before his desk waiting for him to speak. He did not offer me a seat. He did not offer a polite greeting or engage in any customary small talk. Instead, he reached across his desk and picked up my heavy leather portfolio, the one containing the brilliant designs that had secured this interview. He looked at it for a brief moment and then tossed it carelessly across the smooth surface of his desk. It landed near the edge with a dull thud. I have a very strict policy about honesty in my firm. Zuri, he said, his voice deep and rumbling with quiet intensity. I review every candidate thoroughly. I was incredibly impressed by the structural integrity of your proposals. However, my office received a rather interesting phone call this morning regarding your personal character. He reached out and pressed a button on his sleek desktop phone. The speakerphone activated, and a recorded voicemail began to play loudly in the quiet office. The voice that echoed through the room belonged to my father, Desmond. His tone was dripping with that familiar manufactured concern that he used to manipulate everyone around him. Sterling, my father's voice said smoothly through the speaker. This is Desmond. I was informed by my industry contacts that my estranged daughter Zuri is interviewing at your firm today. As a fellow businessman, I felt a moral obligation to warn you. Zuri was expelled from our family firm 3 years ago because she embezzled $500,000 from our corporate accounts. She is deeply unstable and highly deceptive. We handled the matter privately to protect the family name, but I cannot let a respected colleague fall into her trap. Hire her and you are hiring a criminal. The recording ended with a sharp click. The heavy silence returned to the room, pressing down on my shoulders. My father had actually done it. He had tracked my movements and tried to poison my only chance at a real career. He was making sure his threat from the restaurant napkin became a reality. He wanted me starved out of the industry entirely so I would have no choice but to crawl back to him. Mr. Sterling folded his hands on the desk and leaned forward, his piercing gaze locked directly onto my face. So Zuri, he said quietly, your own father, a man with immense power and credibility in this city, just personally warned me that you stole $500,000 from his company. In this industry, trust is our most valuable currency. Tell me right now why on earth I should hire a thief. I did not flinch. I did not burst into tears of frustration or desperately try to defend my moral character. I knew that in the world of high-stakes corporate architecture, words meant absolutely nothing. Only results mattered. Defending myself against a lie would only make me look weak and desperate. I looked at the portfolio he had tossed aside, and then I looked at the massive glass whiteboard covering the entire right wall of his office. There were a few blue and black dry erase markers resting on the metal ledge. May I use your board? I asked, keeping my voice completely steady and devoid of any emotion. Mr. Sterling raised a single eyebrow in surprise. He clearly expected me to beg for mercy or launch into a frantic emotional defense. He gestured slowly toward the wall, granting me permission. I walked over to the glass board, picked up a black marker, and removed the cap. I did not look at him as I began to draw. You are currently bidding against my father company for the final city permits on the new waterfront project, I said, as my hand moved rapidly across the glass. The city council has praised my sister Kendra for her visionary design of the twin central towers. They believe her concept is flawless. I drew the exact skyline of the proposed waterfront project from memory. I sketched the foundational grid, the support columns, and the complex glass facade that was meant to make the towers look like they were floating above the river basin. I drew with furious precision, mapping out the angles and structural lines perfectly. The design, my sister is taking credit for, relies on a cantilevered structural support system. I continued writing out the complex mathematical load-bearing equations next to the drawings. The aesthetic is beautiful, but Kendra is not an engineer. She is a socialite playing architect. She does not understand the fundamental mechanics of the land she is building on. I switched to a blue marker and began drawing the subterranean soil composition of the Atlanta riverfront underneath the towers. The soil near that specific curve of the river basin is highly saturated and prone to micro-subsidence. I explained, drawing the exact geological strata layers. My father development team plans to use standard deep pile foundations, stopping at 90 feet, because that is the most cost-effective option for their budget. They are relying on the tensile strength of the steel frame to compensate for the soft soil. I wrote out another set of calculations circling a specific variable in red, but they are severely underestimating the wind shear force acting on the massive glass facades of those specific twin towers, I said, turning to look at Mr. Sterling for the first time. I calculated the aerodynamic drag coefficient 3 years ago when I originally created those blueprints before my father kicked me out of the house. The wind shear combined with the localized soil subsidence creates an asymmetrical load. If they build those towers according to Kendra's stolen and poorly copied plans, the structural integrity of the central pillars will begin to fail within 36 months. The glass panels will buckle under the uneven pressure and the entire eastern tower will begin a catastrophic sink into the river basin. It will cost my father over $400 million in emergency structural reinforcements just to prevent a total collapse. Mr. Sterling was staring at the board completely transfixed. He stood up slowly from his desk and walked closer, his eyes tracking the complex math and structural diagrams I had just mapped out in under 5 minutes. "You left a trap in the designs," he whispered, his voice reflecting pure realization. "I did not leave a trap." I corrected him, placing the cap back on the marker and setting it down. "I left intentional fail-safes in my original drafting files. Fail-safes that require a specific modified foundation matrix to work. When my father fired me and handed my hard work over to my sister so she could claim the glory, she simply deleted my foundation matrix because it looked too expensive and complicated. She traced over my genius without understanding the basic physics behind it. She is going to build a $2 billion disaster because she is too arrogant to realize what she does not know." I walked back to the center of the room and stood tall, looking directly into the eyes of the most powerful architect in the city. "You asked me why you should hire a thief, Mr. Sterling. The answer is simple. You should not hire a thief. You should hire the true mastermind behind the most lucrative project in this city. My father knows I am the only person who can actually execute that design, which is exactly why he is terrified of me working for your firm. He did not call you to warn you about a criminal. He called you because he knows that if you put me in a room with a drafting table, I will completely dismantle his entire empire piece by piece." The room was dead silent save for the faint hum of the city traffic far below the glass windows. Mr. Sterling looked from the meticulously detailed whiteboard back to me. The cold, skeptical expression on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a look of profound respect and dangerous anticipation. He had seen through the noise and the lies. He recognized the raw, undeniable talent standing in his office. My father had tried to bury me alive under the weight of his false accusations, but he had only succeeded in pushing me directly into the hands of the one man who possessed the power to help me burn his fraudulent legacy to the ground. Sterling stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the complex structural diagrams and mathematical equations I had drawn across his pristine glass board. The ambient noise of the Atlanta traffic far below the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to fade away entirely, leaving only the heavy sound of my own steady breathing. Then, very slowly, the corners of his mouth began to turn upward. It was not the predatory smile of a rival corporate shark who had just discovered a fatal weakness in his enemy. It was a smile of pure, genuine recognition, a deep, knowing expression that made the fine lines around his dark eyes crinkle with profound satisfaction. He lifted his hands and began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate applause that echoed loudly in the massive executive office, wrapping around me like a sudden, unexpected blanket of validation. He walked slowly around the edge of his heavy, reclaimed wood desk, never taking his sharp, observant eyes off my face. He did not even glance at my ruined portfolio resting near the edge of his desk anymore. He only looked at me. "Your father is an absolute fool, Zuri," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that commanded the room. "Desmond is a dangerous, greedy fool who cannot recognize a flawless diamond even when it is placed directly into the palms of his hands. But then again, Desmond never did have the vision required to build something that truly lasts. He only knows how to take, how to exploit, and how to destroy everything beautiful around him just to feed his own massive ego." Sterling moved gracefully toward the sprawling glass windows, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. He clasped his hands behind his back, and the morning sunlight caught the distinguished silver hair at his temples. "The entire industry thinks I am your father's biggest rival," he continued, speaking out to the glass and the steel of the city. "The society pages and the real estate blogs think I built this massive architectural empire purely out of a vindictive desire to crush Desmond and steal his market share. They think this is just a typical war between two wealthy black families fighting for dominance over the local development scene. But the truth is much deeper than corporate competition or petty rivalry. The truth, Zuri, is rooted in a sacred promise I made a very long time ago." He turned back to face me, and the raw emotional intensity in his gaze made me hold my breath. "Before I was the chief executive officer of this firm, before I had the wealth and the power to command this skyline, I was just a young, struggling architect from the South Side, with nothing but a battered sketchbook and a whole lot of desperate ambition. I spent years trying to break into the commercial design world, but the elite white-owned firms in this city shut their heavy oak doors right in my face every single time. They looked at my skin color and decided I was only fit to draft residential garages. I was broke and exhausted and completely desperate for anyone to give me a real chance to prove my worth. And finally, someone did. A man who possessed more integrity, brilliance, and quiet power in his little finger than your father has in his entire body. His name was Elijah. My grandfather's name hung in the quiet air between us, carrying a sudden heavy weight that instantly tightened my chest and made my throat go completely dry. My grandfather Elijah had been the original founder of our family real estate dynasty. He was an absolute legend in the Black community of Atlanta, a true pioneer who built affordable housing, grand community centers, and safe spaces for our people long before he ever moved into the lucrative world of commercial real estate. He had passed away 12 years ago when I was just a teenager, and the loss had left a massive void in my life that no one else in my toxic family ever bothered to fill. My heart began to pound a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "You knew my grandfather?" I asked, keeping my voice barely above a quiet whisper. Sterling smiled a deeply sad, nostalgic smile. "Knew him," he repeated softly. "He was my mentor, my teacher, my greatest advocate, and my savior. Elijah took me under his wing when the rest of the corporate world left me out in the cold. He brought me into his firm and taught me everything I know about structural integrity, not just in buildings, but in human character. He taught me how to lay a solid foundation that could withstand any political or economic storm. But more importantly, Elijah was a man of profound observation. He saw everything, and he knew exactly who his own son was." Sterling walked slowly back across the room, his expensive leather shoes sinking silently into the plush gray carpet. He stopped just a few feet away from me. "Elijah loved your father deeply because Desmond was his own flesh and blood, but he was never blind to his dark nature. Elijah saw the corruption taking root in Desmond very early on. He saw the ruthless greed, the disgusting arrogance, the way your father viewed people as disposable stepping stones rather than human beings worthy of respect. Elijah knew that once he passed away, Desmond would eventually take over the company and poison the beautiful empire he had spent a lifetime building. He knew Desmond would trade community uplift for luxury profit margins and surround himself with shallow socialites and yes men, like your brother-in-law Brad. I swallowed hard trying to process the revelation. My grandfather had always been a quiet, observant man. I suddenly remembered him sitting with me in his vast oak-paneled study for hours on end, watching me build complex towers out of wooden blocks, while the rest of the family attended flashy country club galas. He was the only person in my entire life who ever looked at my childhood sketches and told me I had a rare, beautiful gift. He never endlessly praised my sister Kendra the way my mother Valerie and my father did. He just watched them all preen and boast with a quiet, sorrowful expression that I was simply too young to understand at the time. But Elijah also saw something else in that house. Sterling continued, his voice softening incredibly. He saw a little girl who possessed his exact same spark of genius. He watched you draft complex structural shapes before you even understood the foundational math behind them. He saw your resilience, your quiet brilliance, and your refusal to conform to their shallow expectations. He knew you were the true heir to his legacy, not in name, but in pure spirit. And he also knew with absolute certainty that Desmond would eventually try to crush that spirit because deeply insecure men always try to destroy the power they cannot manipulate or control. Sterling walked past me and moved toward the far wall of his executive office. The wall was covered in rich, dark mahogany paneling that looked completely seamless. He pressed his flat palm against a specific section of the wood, and a hidden panel popped open with a soft mechanical click. Behind the decorative wood panel was a heavy steel wall safe built directly into the concrete structure of the building. He quickly punched in a complex numerical code shielding the keypad with his body. The heavy metal door chimed and swung open, revealing the dark velvet-lined interior. I stood perfectly frozen in the center of the room, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening right in front of me. The man who was supposed to be my family's greatest and most ruthless enemy was speaking about my grandfather with a reverence and unconditional love that my own father had never possessed. Sterling reached his hand deep into the safe and carefully pulled out a single solitary item. It was an envelope. It looked incredibly old. The thick paper yellowed and slightly curled at the edges from the long passage of time. It was sealed shut on the back with a thick puddle of dark crimson wax pressed firmly with a heavy signet ring. Sterling closed the safe, pushed the mahogany panel back into place, and walked back over to me. He held the aged envelope in both of his hands, as if it were the most fragile and valuable artifact in the entire world. He stopped directly in front of me and extended his hands, offering the envelope to me. I looked down at the textured parchment. Across the front, written in the elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting that I instantly recognized as my grandfather's, were my initials written in faded black ink. ZEA. Zuri Elijah Architecture. Elijah gave this to me 12 years ago, Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping to a solemn, heavy whisper. It was just a few weeks before he passed away. His health was failing rapidly, and he knew the end was coming soon, so he called me to his bedside in secret. He handed me this exact envelope and made me swear a sacred binding oath that I would guard it with my very life. He gave me highly specific, non-negotiable instructions on exactly when and how to deliver it to you. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached out and gently took the envelope from his grasp. The thick paper felt dry and heavily textured beneath my fingertips, grounding me in the reality of the moment. The dark red wax seal was still perfectly intact, bearing the distinct architectural crest of my grandfather's original firm. "Why did he give it to you?" I asked, staring down at the beautiful faded handwriting while trying to keep my voice from breaking. "Why not give it to me directly before he died so I could protect myself?" "Because you were just a child," Mr. Sterling answered gently, looking at me with deep compassion. "You were only 14 years old, and you were not ready to carry the massive burden of what is hidden inside this paper. And if Desmond had found out about it, he would have stolen it from you, destroyed it, and punished you for it, before you even had a chance to understand its true power. Elijah was a master strategist, Zuri. He played the long game better than anyone I have ever met. He told me to take this envelope, lock it away in my safe, and never speak a single word of it to anyone on earth. He told me to watch over you from a distance, to keep a quiet eye on your academic progress, your brilliant designs, and your inevitable struggles within that toxic house. He knew your father would eventually cross a line that could not be uncrossed. Sterling took a respectful step back, giving me physical space to process the overwhelming flood of information. I looked at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation. My fingers traced the edges of the envelope, feeling the weight of a 12-year-old's secret resting in my palms. Elijah told me to keep this hidden until his favorite granddaughter was pushed to the absolute edge, Mr. Sterling recited, speaking the words slowly and deliberately, as if they were a sacred scripture he had memorized daily. He said I would know the exact moment to intervene. He said it would be the precise moment when Desmond tried to strip away your entire future, when your own family cast you out into the street, when you had absolutely nothing left to lose, and when the brutal fire of raw survival had finally hardened your soft heart into unbreakable steel. He said that was the moment you would finally be ready to fight back and claim what is yours. The heavy, profound truth of those words settled over me, wrapping around my trembling shoulders like a warm, protective cloak. My grandfather had known. 12 years ago, lying in his deathbed, struggling to breathe, he had foreseen the exact crushing cruelty my father would inflict upon me. He knew my father would frame me for embezzlement, kick me out of the only home I knew, and try to starve me out of the architecture industry by blacklisting my name. He knew I would be forced to scrub tables, endure the racist microaggressions of my brother-in-law Brad, and suffer the deepest humiliations just to survive. But instead of leaving me completely defenseless against their wealth and power, he had spent his final days meticulously preparing a hidden weapon for me. He had entrusted my ultimate salvation to the one man my father feared more than anyone else in Atlanta. The tears that my father and Brad and Kendra had so desperately tried to wring out of me at the restaurant last night, the tears I had refused to shed while sweeping up their spilled wine, finally began to prick hotly at the corners of my eyes. But they were not tears of pain, humiliation, or defeat. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. I had spent the last 3 years feeling completely abandoned by the universe, believing that I was entirely alone in a dark world, specifically designed to crush me into dust. But I was never alone. Not for a single second. My grandfather's love had been reaching across a decade of time, waiting silently in the dark, locked in a steel safe until I was strong enough and angry enough to receive it. I looked down at the heavy crimson wax seal resting in my hands. My father truly thought he had won. He thought his pathetic $5 tip and his cruel, deeply arrogant message, written on a stained restaurant napkin, had sealed my fate as a poor, disgraced waitress forever. He was probably sitting in his lavish corner office right at this very moment, sipping expensive imported coffee that my talentless sister Kendra had fetched for him, laughing with Brad about how easily they had destroyed my life. They had absolutely no idea that their petty, vicious attempt to humiliate me had been the exact catalyst needed to unlock a 12-year-old contingency plan that would completely annihilate them. I slid my right thumb under the top flap of the yellowed envelope, positioning it right beneath the heavy wax seal. The silence in the executive office was absolute, heavy with anticipation. Mr. Sterling watched me with a look of quiet, immense pride, waiting to see if I possessed the raw courage that Elijah had promised him I would have. I did not hesitate for another second. I pushed my thumb firmly upward, hearing the crisp, sharp snap as the dried red wax finally broke apart, fracturing into tiny crimson pieces that fell softly onto the plush gray carpet below. I opened the aged flap, took a deep, steadying breath, and reached my fingers inside, pulling out the heavy folded legal parchment that had been waiting for me for over a decade, ready to change the skyline of my entire life. The thick folded paper felt heavy in my hands. It was not a letter. It was not a sentimental note or a final goodbye from a dying grandfather. It was a legal document printed on thick official stock paper, bordered by a complex watermark that caught the light shining through the office windows. I unfolded the pages slowly, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon at the top of the first page. The header read, Irrevocable Deed of Trust and Land Transfer. I read the words, but my brain struggled to process their massive magnitude. The document was a binding legal transfer of property rights, executed and notarized, exactly 12 years ago. I looked at the specific parcel description listed carefully on the second page. It detailed exactly 50 acres of prime undeveloped commercial real estate situated directly along the curvature of the Atlanta River Basin. My breath caught sharply in my throat making my chest ache with a sudden fierce intensity. It was the exact same 50 acres of land where my father was currently planning to build his $2 billion waterfront project. The very same land he had been bragging about to his family at the restaurant just 12 hours ago while I wiped crumbs from their table. I kept reading, my eyes tracing the lines of black ink as they revealed a secret so profound it felt like the floor was shifting beneath my feet. According to the deed, my grandfather Elijah had secretly carved out the most valuable piece of property from the family company portfolio long before he died. He had transferred the irrevocable lifetime ownership of those specific 50 acres into a blind trust, completely shielding it from public corporate records. And listed at the very bottom of the document, as the sole and absolute beneficiary of that blind trust, was my name, Zuri. The letters were typed clearly, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation or legal loopholes. My father Desmond did not own the waterfront property. My family real estate empire did not own the waterfront property. I owned it. I owned the dirt, the water rights, and the lucrative airspace above it. I was the sole proprietor of the most coveted piece of commercial real estate in the entire state of Georgia. I looked up at Mr. Sterling, my mind spinning with the explosive realization of what this actually meant for my toxic family. My father had spent the last 2 years actively soliciting massive investments from ruthless Wall Street firms. He and my arrogant brother-in-law Brad had been distributing financial prospectuses and hosting lavish pitch meetings, claiming they held the exclusive development rights to the riverfront. They were asking wealthy investors to hand over $2 billion to build a massive commercial center on dirt they did not legally possess. They were selling a ghost. Mr. Sterling watched the profound realization wash over my face, his dark eyes gleaming with a quiet, dangerous satisfaction. He walked over to a polished crystal decanter sitting on a sleek mahogany side table. He poured a rich amber liquid into 2 heavy crystal glasses, the sound of the liquid splashing softly into the glass echoing in the quiet office. Elijah knew Desmond would assume the land naturally defaulted to the corporate portfolio upon his death, Mr. Sterling said, handing me one of the heavy crystal glasses. Desmond is so deeply arrogant and entitled that he never even bothered to do a deep title search on his own father's private personal holdings. He just assumed the entire empire was his to command by birthright. But Elijah made sure the deed was buried so deeply under layers of corporate shell companies and obscure blind trusts that Desmond would never find it unless he knew exactly what to look for. I took the glass, my fingers gripping the heavy crystal so tightly my knuckles turned pale. My father is committing federal wire fraud, I whispered, the sheer catastrophic scale of the crime finally settling over me. Brad is the chief financial officer of the company. Brad signed all the financial disclosures and the official investment prospectuses. They are actively transmitting fraudulent claims across state lines to secure billions of dollars in funding. They are defrauding institutional investors. Mr. Sterling took a slow sip of his bourbon and nodded, his expression hardening into something truly lethal. Exactly, he said, his voice laced with a dangerous, icy calm. If Desmond had just stayed in his lane and continued to build his standard luxury condos, he might have gotten away with his gross incompetence for a few more years. But his massive ego made him greedy for a permanent legacy. He wanted to build a towering monument to himself. He staked his entire reputation and the financial solvency of your family firm on this specific waterfront project. And he is doing it all on your land without your permission. He has built his entire house of cards on a foundation that belongs exclusively to the daughter he threw out into the street. Mr. Sterling walked back to his desk and leaned against the edge, looking down at me with an expression of fierce, unwavering support. Elijah did not just leave you a piece of valuable land, Zuri. He left you a fully loaded gun. And now it is time for you to pull the trigger. But you cannot do it alone. Desmond has a massive legal team and incredibly deep pockets. If you just walk into a courtroom with that deed today, he will tie you up in vicious litigation for the next 20 years. He will claim Elijah was not of sound mind when he signed it, or that the document is an elaborate forgery. He will use his wealth to bleed you dry until you cannot afford to fight him anymore. He will destroy you legally, just like he tried to destroy you professionally. I looked down at the bourbon in my glass, watching the amber liquid swirl against the crystal. So what do we do? I asked, knowing that the brilliant man standing in front of me already had a flawless master plan mapped out in his mind. Mr. Sterling smiled, that same sharp, knowing smile that held absolute ruin for my enemies. We let him dig his own grave, he said simply, and then we wait for him to step inside before we push the dirt over his head. 3 days from now, your father is hosting the most exclusive charity fundraising gala of the entire year. It is supposed to be the crowning event of his entire career. He has invited every major political figure, every wealthy developer, and every key Wall Street investor to the grand ballroom of the Atlanta Plaza Hotel. The explicit purpose of this massive gala is to officially sign the $2 billion term sheets in front of the local press to cement the investment deals and make the waterfront project a permanent reality. Mr. Sterling walked back over to the glass whiteboard where my brilliant structural drawings still sat. He picked up a felt eraser and slowly wiped away the flawed, dangerous foundation that my sister Kendra had stolen from me. We are going to let them host their beautiful, extravagant party, he continued, his voice echoing with quiet, intense anticipation. We are going to let Brad smile and shake hands with the wealthy investors while feeding them absolute lies. We are going to let Kendra stand on the stage under the bright spotlights and take full credit for your architectural genius. We are going to let your mother Valerie preen for the news cameras and pretend she is the flawless matriarch of a perfect, untouchable dynasty. We are going to let Desmond get right to the very edge of his ultimate victory, where he thinks he has finally secured his legacy forever. And then Mr. Sterling turned back to me, his eyes blazing with a fierce protective fire that reminded me so much of my grandfather. You and I are going to walk through those heavy ballroom doors and tear his entire world apart piece by piece. We are going to let them trap themselves so deeply in federal fraud that no amount of money or high-priced lawyers will ever be able to save them from prison. He reached into his tailored suit jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He placed it on the desk next to a thick stack of official corporate documents that had been waiting there the entire time. I am offering you a full legal partnership at Sterling Architecture, Zuri. He said, his tone entirely serious. I am not offering you an assistant role. I am not offering you a junior drafting position. I am offering you a full equal partnership with your name on the door next to mine. Your grandfather gave me my start when no one else in this city would look twice at a young black architect with big dreams. He lifted me up when the industry tried to hold me down. Now it is my turn to honor his legacy by giving his rightful heir the platform she truly deserves. Together we will design and build the waterfront project the right way, your way. But first we have to clear the toxic trash off your property. I looked at the silver pen and then at the partnership contract resting on the desk. 3 grueling years of scrubbing dirty tables flashed before my eyes. 3 years of being called a thief by the people who were supposed to protect me. 3 years of watching my sister steal my life and parade it around as her own. The humiliating $5 tip from last night. The arrogant sneer on Brad. Face the cold indifference in my mother's eyes. It all felt like a distant, fading memory now. The universe had finally tipped the scales in my favor, and the weight of it was incredibly empowering. I set my crystal glass down on the desk, picked up the silver pen, and signed my name on the partnership agreement with a steady, unwavering hand. The ink flowed smoothly across the paper, binding me to a new family, a chosen family, built on respect and mutual vision, rather than manipulation and deceit. It felt like signing my own emancipation papers. I was no longer the disgraced daughter of the city's most ruthless developer. I was Zuri, Elijah, the sole owner of the waterfront, and the newest partner at the most prestigious architecture firm in Atlanta. Mr. Sterling nodded in deep approval, taking the signed document and sliding it safely into a leather folder. Good, he said. Now we have exactly 72 hours to prepare for the gala. We need to make sure the trap is perfectly set, so that when the jaws finally snap shut, there is absolutely no way for Desmond or Brad to escape the catastrophic legal consequences of their actions. We spent the next several hours meticulously mapping out every single detail of the destruction of my toxic family. Mr. Sterling explained how his elite team of corporate lawyers would be on standby, waiting just outside the ballroom doors. We discussed the exact sequence of events that would take place at the gala, orchestrating the timing down to the very minute. We planned how to systematically dismantle Kendra and expose her stolen designs to the entire architectural community before delivering the final fatal blow to Desmond and Brad regarding the massive land fraud. Every angle was covered, every potential loophole was closed. It was a masterclass in corporate warfare, and I was the primary weapon. As we plotted the absolute ruin of the people who shared my blood, I realized I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. My mother had watched me get thrown onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back, without shedding a single tear. My father had actively tried to ruin my future, calling every firm in the city to ensure I starved just to protect his own fragile ego. My sister had stolen my intellectual property to build a fake lucrative career because she was too lazy and incompetent to do the work herself. And my brother-in-law had treated me like a subservient peasant, throwing spare change at me because it made him feel superior. They had spent my entire life teaching me that loyalty was strictly conditional, and that ruthless power was the only thing that truly mattered in this world. Now I was going to use their own brutal lessons against them. I was going to give them exactly what they had earned. The warm southern sun began to set over the sweeping Atlanta skyline, casting long golden shadows across the spacious executive office. The glass buildings outside caught the fading light, glowing like embers against the darkening sky. Mr. Sterling picked up the heavy crystal decanter and poured us both another generous measure of bourbon. To Elijah, he said, raising his glass in a silent, solemn tribute to the grandfather who had loved me enough to orchestrate this magnificent vengeance from beyond the grave. He had seen my pain before it even happened, and he had armed me for a war I did not even know I was going to fight. To Elijah, I echoed, clinking my crystal glass gently against his. The clear, ringing sound echoed in the quiet room, signaling the official beginning of the end for my father's corrupt empire. The trap was flawlessly set, the bait was perfectly laid, and in exactly 3 days, the entire city of Atlanta would watch in stunned silence as the untouchable dynasty finally crumbled to dust by my hands. 3 days passed in an absolute blur of meticulous preparation and relentless strategic focus. Mr. Sterling and I worked tirelessly out of his sprawling private estate, hidden deep within the forested hills of Buckhead, finalizing the dense legal framework of the trap that was about to snap shut on my father and his fraudulent empire. We pored over the land trust documents, the historical tax records, and the federal statutes regarding wire fraud, ensuring that every single loophole was completely sealed. When Saturday evening finally arrived, the air in the city of Atlanta felt incredibly thick and heavy with the promise of a massive summer storm. Dark clouds gathered ominously over the glowing skyscrapers, mirroring the catastrophic ruin that was about to rain down on my toxic family. I sat in the back of a blacked-out luxury SUV as we drove toward the Atlanta Plaza Hotel, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm of absolute certainty. The terrified, anxious girl who had been thrown out of her own home 3 years ago was dead, and the exhausted waitress who had scrubbed floors for minimum wage no longer existed. I was riding into battle fully armed and completely untouchable. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Plaza Hotel was a legendary space renowned for hosting the most exclusive and expensive events in the entire state of Georgia. As an architect, I had always admired its sweeping vaulted ceilings, the intricate gold leaf crown molding, and the massive arched windows that looked out over the glittering city center. Tonight, my father Desmond had rented out the entire top floor to host his defining masterpiece. This was a massive charity and investment gala specifically orchestrated to serve as the dazzling backdrop for the official signing of the $2 billion term sheets. Desmond had invited the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence, local politicians, wealthy real estate moguls, and influential community leaders, blending them seamlessly with the ruthless white shoe Wall Street investors who controlled the institutional capital he so desperately needed. The room was a carefully curated sea of expensive tailored tuxedos, glittering diamond necklaces, and flowing designer gowns. It was a theatrical performance of extreme wealth and untouchable power designed purely to blind the investors to the massive rotting lie at the center of the project. Standing in the shadows of the grand foyer, just outside the closed mahogany doors of the ballroom, I could hear the low thrum of classical string music mixing with the arrogant laughter of the city elite. Through the crack in the door, my security detail allowed me to observe the sickening display playing out inside. Desmond was holding court near the absolute center of the room, surrounded by a circle of powerful hedge fund managers. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo and a smile that radiated pure predatory confidence. He was shaking hands and slapping backs, projecting the flawless image of a visionary titan of industry who was single-handedly elevating the local community. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was already crumbling into dust. He believed he had completely silenced his biggest threat by getting me fired from my restaurant job just days ago. He thought I was sitting alone in my cramped studio apartment crying over my ruined life while he secured his permanent legacy. Valerie, my mother, glided gracefully through the crowded room, playing the role of the devoted, flawless matriarch to absolute perfection. She wore a shimmering silver gown that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers with every step she took. Her smile was tight and practiced, as she directed the catering staff with sharp, imperious hand gestures, making sure every crystal champagne flute was perfectly filled and every hors d'oeuvre was flawlessly presented. She was in her absolute element, feeding off the envious stares of the other society wives. Her entire identity was wrapped up in this hollow performance of superiority. Near the front of the room, standing proudly beside a massive, intricately detailed scale model of the waterfront project, was my sister Kendra. She was soaking in the lavish praise from wealthy donors, nodding demurely, as they called her a brilliant architectural prodigy. She traced her manicured fingers over the tiny model towers, accepting compliments for a structural genius she did not possess and a design she had brutally stolen from my private computer. Hovering right beside Kendra was Brad, my arrogant brother-in-law. He was aggressively networking with the New York financiers, using his privileged background to build rapid rapport with the white investors who controlled the $2 billion funding. He puffed out his chest and laughed loudly, assuring the executives that the term sheets were ready for their final signatures tonight. Brad was the chief financial officer, and he had personally signed off on every single fraudulent financial disclosure distributed to those men. He was basking in the unearned glory of his position, completely unaware that he had just signed his own federal prison sentence. They were all so entirely consumed by their own arrogant delusions of victory that they did not sense the absolute ruin waiting just on the other side of the wooden doors. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the cool, air-conditioned breeze of the foyer fill my lungs. I gave a subtle nod to the massive security contractors standing beside me. Mr. Sterling had assigned his personal elite security detail to flank me for the entire evening. They were 4 men in sharp black suits with discreet earpieces who moved with lethal silent precision, forming an impenetrable physical barrier around me. I was not wearing the drab thrift store suit from my interview or the stained black apron from the restaurant. I was draped in a breathtaking custom emerald green gown that swept elegantly across the polished marble floor. The deep, rich color contrasted perfectly against my dark skin, making me look radiant and commanding. The bodice of the dress was an architectural marvel of structured silk folding and wrapping around my torso like modern armor, while the long train pooled behind me like liquid glass. My hair was styled in an intricate braided crown, standing tall and unapologetic. I did not look down. I did not shrink myself to make anyone else comfortable. The security guards reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany double doors open simultaneously. The thick doors swung wide with a deep, resonant thud that instantly cut through the low hum of the wealthy crowd. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the blinding golden light of the grand ballroom. I walked straight down the center aisle with my head held high, projecting the terrifying absolute calm of a queen returning to conquer a stolen kingdom. The reaction from the massive crowd was immediate and deeply satisfying. The lively, boisterous conversations near the entrance simply died away as people turned their heads to look at the striking woman entering the room, flanked by such an intimidating display of elite security. The string quartet playing in the corner seemed to lose their rhythm for a brief, halting moment as the cellist paused his bow to watch my dramatic entrance. Whispers began to ripple through the packed ballroom, spreading like a fast-moving current across the sea of expensive suits and designer dresses. Some of the older family friends and longtime business associates recognized my face, their eyes widening in absolute shock as they realized that Desmond's disgraced, banished daughter had just crashed the most important financial event of the decade. I heard the sharp gasps of the society wives, who had been told I was a mentally unstable criminal who had fled the state in shame. Others who did not know my history simply stared in total awe, captivated by the sheer undeniable power and wealth radiating from my presence. They assumed I must be a major unexpected investor or a mysterious foreign dignitary arriving to grace the event. The murmurs grew louder, swelling into a collective hum of intense curiosity and brewing scandal that completely derailed the carefully curated atmosphere of the gala. The sea of guests naturally began to part down the middle, stepping aside to make way for my security detail as I continued my slow, deliberate march toward the center of the room. It did not take long for the disruption to reach the front, where the VIP investor tables were located. My father was in the middle of a loud, boisterous laugh, shaking hands with a prominent hedge fund manager when he noticed the sudden shifting tide in the room. He turned his head, following the stunned gaze of the Wall Street investors around him. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, the fake charming smile completely melted off his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. His mouth fell open slightly, and the hand he was using to hold his crystal champagne flute began to tremble so violently that the golden liquid sloshed over the rim and spilled onto his expensive velvet tuxedo. All the blood rapidly drained from his cheeks, making him look incredibly old and remarkably frail in the span of a single second. The ghost of the daughter he thought he had buried alive had just walked through the front door wearing a dress that cost more than his car. Valerie was standing a few feet away, instructing a nervous waiter about the appetizer trays. The sudden drop in noise caused her to turn and see what had silenced her powerful husband. Her mannequin flew up to cover her mouth, and she visibly staggered backward, her high heels slipping on the polished floor. She nearly knocked over an entire tray of drinks in her shock. Her perfect society image, the flawless, affluent facade she valued more than her own children, was suddenly under direct, catastrophic threat. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic, as the meticulously crafted lies she had told her country club friends about my disappearance threatened to unravel right in front of her face. Kendra and Brad were still hovering arrogantly near the scale model of the waterfront project, completely oblivious to the shifting atmosphere, until the crowd literally parted down the middle to reveal my approach. Kendra looked up from the miniature glass towers, and her smug, confident expression instantly shattered into a million pieces. Her eyes darted wildly over my emerald gown, taking in the radiant, undeniable power I was projecting, and the elite security detail protecting me. The deep, ugly green of extreme visceral jealousy washed over her features, distorting her pretty face into a harsh, bitter scowl as she realized she was being instantly eclipsed in her own spotlight. She had spent 3 years pretending to be the superior, brilliant sister, and in 3 seconds my mere presence had reduced her back to a fraudulent shadow. Brad narrowed his eyes, his face turning a blotchy, angry red, as initial confusion rapidly morphed into aggressive annoyance. He clearly did not understand how the poor, pathetic waitress he had humiliated and gotten fired just days ago was now commanding the absolute attention of every billionaire in the room. He looked at my father, expecting Desmond to immediately summon the hotel security and have me violently dragged out into the street. But Desmond was completely paralyzed by the sight of me, unable to comprehend how I had bypassed the hotel's strict security protocols and why I was flanked by men wearing the sterling architecture corporate insignia pins on their lapels. I kept my pace deliberate and slow, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out across the ballroom as I moved steadily toward the raised podium where the Wall Street executives were sitting with their pristine, unsigned contracts. I did not break eye contact with my father, letting him feel the full, crushing weight of his impending doom. The sheer terror radiating from his rigid posture was absolute poetry. He knew I had not come to beg for my family back. He knew I had come for blood. Desmond finally snapped out of his paralyzed state of shock and immediately went into aggressive, desperate damage control mode. He could not afford a public scene right before the $2 billion term sheets were signed. The investors were already looking confused and wary, sensing the sudden volatile tension radiating from the host. Desmond grabbed Valerie aggressively by her bare arm, his fingers digging into her skin, and hissed something furious and urgent into her ear. He signaled wildly to Brad with a sharp jerk of his head. The three of them began to move rapidly through the parted crowd, trying desperately to maintain casual, strained smiles for the onlookers, while ruthlessly maneuvering to intercept me before I could reach the VIP tables. They moved like panicked, cornered predators, trying to cut off a threat they did not fully understand. They abandoned their carefully curated high society postures, pushing past their wealthy guests in a frantic scramble to block my path. I watched them hurrying toward me, their faces tight with quiet rage and absolute terror, and I felt a cold, ruthless smile touch the corners of my lips. I slowed my pace just a fraction, allowing them to funnel me away from the main floor and toward the slightly secluded but still highly visible corridor that led to the private executive suites. The trap was set perfectly, and the rats were running blindly and aggressively directly into the cage I had built for them. I allowed them to herd me just past the heavy mahogany doors into the secluded but highly visible corridor that ran parallel to the grand ballroom. The lighting out here was much dimmer, casting long, dramatic shadows across the imported silk wallpaper and the thick woven carpets. The lively music of the string quartet and the arrogant chatter of the Wall Street investors became muffled behind the thick walls, providing a surreal, elegant soundtrack to the absolute venom radiating from the three people storming toward me. My elite security detail moved seamlessly with me, stepping just slightly ahead to form a loose but impenetrable physical barrier that forced my father, my mother, and my arrogant brother-in-law to stop exactly 3 feet away from my custom emerald gown. Desmond was the first to reach me. He was breathing heavily, his broad chest heaving violently under his expensive bespoke velvet tuxedo. His dark eyes darted nervously to the sterling architecture corporate insignia pins resting on the lapels of my towering security guards. The sight of his greatest rival's logo, protecting his discarded daughter, clearly sent a shockwave of profound confusion through his greedy mind. But his massive ego quickly overrode his caution. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "How did you get past the hotel's security?" Desmond hissed, keeping his voice strictly lowered to a harsh, aggressive whisper, so the wealthy guests inside the ballroom would not hear the commotion. "Whose dress did you steal to sneak in here, Zuri? I swear to God, if you have come here to make a scene and beg for your job back in front of my investors, I will have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs. I will tell them you are here to extort me, just like you stole that $500,000 from my company 3 years ago." I stood perfectly still, my posture flawless and completely unbothered. I did not flinch at his threats. I simply looked at him, analyzing the desperate sweat beading on his forehead and the frantic twitch in his jaw. He was a man standing on the edge of a towering cliff, and he had absolutely no idea the ground was already gone. Valerie shoved her way past my father, her shimmering silver gown rustling aggressively against the plush carpet. Her face was a terrifying picture of maternal rejection and high society panic. She looked me up and down, her eyes raking over my flawless hair, my radiant skin, and the incredibly expensive architectural structure of my emerald silk dress. She could not compute how the daughter she had gleefully thrown into poverty was currently looking far more regal and commanding than anyone else in her perfect society circle. "You are ruining everything," Valerie hissed, her manicured fingers curling into tight, angry fists at her sides. She leaned forward as far as the security guards would safely allow, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. "You need to turn around and walk out those doors right this second before you ruin your sister Kendra big night. This is the most important evening of her entire life. She is the lead architect now. She is a brilliant success, and you are nothing but a bitter, jealous failure, trying to steal her spotlight. We told everyone you moved out of state in shame. If my friends at the country club see you here looking like this, they will start asking questions. You are going to destroy the perfect image of this family, Zuri. Leave now." Her words, which would have absolutely shattered my heart and sent me spiraling into a deep depression just a few years ago, simply washed over me like useless drops of rain against solid steel. Valerie cared more about the gossiping whispers of her shallow society friends than she cared about the actual living, breathing daughter standing right in front of her. She was so entirely consumed by the illusion of black excellence that she was completely blind to the spectacular corporate fraud her husband and her favorite daughter were committing right under her nose. Before I could offer her a single word of response, Brad stepped forward. He pushed his way past my parents, exuding the arrogant, unearned confidence of a mediocre white man who believed his mere presence elevated our black family into the upper echelons of corporate America. Brad was the chief financial officer of my father empire, and he wore his title like a heavy crown. He adjusted his expensive designer tie and looked at me with a deeply condescending smirk playing on his thin lips. He viewed this entire family conflict as a simple, annoying financial transaction that he needed to swiftly manage. "All right, let us all just calm down," Brad said, holding his hands up in a patronizing gesture of peace. He looked at Desmond and Valerie with a knowing, superior glance. "Emotional outbursts are not going to solve this problem. Zuri is clearly desperate. Look at her. She probably spent her last minimum wage paycheck renting that dress just to sneak in here and cause a scene because she is drowning in debt. People like her only understand one language." Brad reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He clicked a gold-plated pen and rested the checkbook against his forearm. He did not even look at me while he began to write. He treated me with the exact same dismissive contempt he had shown me at the restaurant when he deliberately knocked his red wine across the table just to watch me clean it up. He thought everybody in the world had a price, and he firmly believed my price was incredibly low. He ripped the crisp paper from the leather binding and stepped right up to the edge of the security barrier. He completely bypassed my personal space and aggressively shoved the freshly written check directly against the silk fabric of my chest, forcing me to either take it or let it fall to the floor. I slowly raised my hand and took the check from his fingers. I looked down at the crisp paper. It was a personal check written out to me for exactly $10,000. To a waitress scrubbing tables for tips, it would have looked like a massive, life-changing fortune. To the sole owner of a 50-acre riverfront property valued at over $2 billion, it looked like absolute pathetic pocket change. "Take this," Brad said, his voice dripping with thick, suffocating condescension. "Take this $10,000, pay off whatever miserable petty debts you have accumulated, and leave this hotel quietly. Go start a new life somewhere far away from Atlanta. Do not embarrass this family in front of my white shoe Wall Street investors, Zuri. Those men in that ballroom control billions of dollars in institutional capital, and we all know you do not belong in this affluent world anymore. You are a waitress. Take your hand out and go back to the shadows where you belong." Valerie let out a sharp breath of relief, nodding quickly in agreement with Brad. "Yes, Zuri, take the money." She pleaded, her voice tight with toxic manipulation. "Brad is being incredibly generous to you after everything you stole from your father. Take his charity and walk away so we can get back to celebrating your sister genius." I stood in the dim corridor holding the $10,000 check lightly between my fingers. The silence stretched out heavy and electric. My security guards did not move a single muscle, waiting for my command. My father crossed arms, looking deeply satisfied by Brad's aggressive transactional dominance. They all truly believed they had won. They believed they had successfully bought my silence and secured their fraudulent empire with a measly $10,000 bribe. I looked up from the check and locked my eyes directly onto Brad's smug, arrogant face. I did not blink. I did not smile. I simply held his gaze with a cold, terrifying emptiness that made the confident smirk on his thin lips waver for the very first time. I lifted both of my hands, holding the crisp paper check right in front of his face, and then moving with agonizingly slow, deliberate precision, I pinched the top edge of the paper and tore the $10,000 check straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound of the thick paper echoed loudly in the quiet hallway, slicing right through the elegant string music drifting from the ballroom. Valerie let out a loud, dramatic gasp of absolute horror. Desmond dropped his arms to his sides, his eyes widening in complete shock. I placed the two torn halves together and slowly tore them again, and then again. I methodically shredded his arrogant, pathetic bribe into tiny, unrecognizable pieces of useless paper. Brad's face turned a blotchy, furious shade of red. His chest puffed out and he opened his mouth to scream at me to call me an ungrateful idiot, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I opened my hands and let the tiny shredded pieces of the $10,000 check flutter through the air, falling like dirty snow onto the toes of his incredibly expensive leather shoes. I stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between us until the security guards had to slightly adjust their stance to accommodate my movement. I leaned in close, so close that I could smell the expensive, strong cologne radiating from his neck and the sudden sour scent of nervous sweat breaking out across his forehead. I lowered my voice to a soft, deadly whisper that only he and my parents could hear. "You should have kept that money, Brad." I whispered, my voice smooth as glass and cold as ice. "You are going to desperately need that $10,000 for your criminal defense retainer tomorrow morning." The reaction was instantaneous and absolutely beautiful to witness. The arrogant, superior smirk completely vanished from Brad's face as if it had been violently wiped away. The aggressive red flush in his cheeks instantly drained, leaving his skin a sickly pale grayish white. His pupils dilated in sudden visceral terror, and he instinctively took a clumsy, stumbling step backward, physically retreating from my words. He knew exactly what those words meant. Brad was the chief financial officer. He was the one who had prepared the massive financial prospectuses. He was the one who had knowingly drafted the corporate investment portfolios, claiming legal ownership of the waterfront property. He knew deep down in his greedy, corrupt soul that the legal foundation of the entire $2 billion project was a massive, unverified risk. And hearing the disgraced waitress sister confidently drop a precise, lethal threat about a criminal defense retainer suddenly activated every single alarm bell in his analytical financial mind. "What did you just say?" Brad stammered, his voice shaking slightly, losing all of its previous booming authority. "What are you talking about, Zuri?" My father pushed forward, his face contorted with renewed aggressive rage, trying to protect his rapidly panicking son-in-law. "She is just talking garbage," Brad Desmond spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is a crazy, bitter dropout trying to scare us because she knows she has absolutely no real power. She is just throwing a childish tantrum." I ignored my father entirely. I kept my piercing gaze locked entirely on Brad, watching the psychological collapse happening behind his terrified eyes. I could see his mind racing through federal statutes, wire fraud penalties, and the catastrophic consequences of misleading institutional investors. I had just planted a massive ticking time bomb directly inside his paranoid brain, and the countdown had officially started. I stepped back, smoothing the flawless silk fabric of my emerald gown. I looked at the three of them standing in a pile of shredded paper, looking completely derailed and terrified. Their carefully constructed high society confidence was rapidly bleeding out onto the hotel carpet. "If you will excuse me," I said, my voice returning to a normal conversational volume carrying clear across the corridor. "I believe the main event is starting inside. I would really hate to miss the moment my brilliant sister takes the stage to present her monumental architectural genius to the world." I did not wait for their response. I simply turned my back on my panicked mother, my furious father, and my rapidly hyperventilating brother-in-law. I gave a subtle nod to my elite security detail, and we began to walk back toward the grand, heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. I left them standing together in the dim hallway, suffocating in their own brewing paranoia. The trap had been successfully sprung, and the first heavy steel door had just slammed shut behind them. Now all I had to do was walk into that crowded, glittering ballroom and wait for Kendra to step onto the illuminated stage and proudly dig the final permanent grave for the entire family. I walked back through the heavy mahogany doors, letting the golden light of the grand ballroom wash over my emerald silk gown. The string quartet had seamlessly transitioned into a swelling, triumphant melody that perfectly matched the electric anticipation humming through the massive space. My elite security detail fanned out slightly, ensuring my path was completely unobstructed as I made my way to a prime vantage point near the center aisle. The Wall Street investors were taking their seats at the front tables, their custom-tailored suits shifting as they prepared for the main event. At the very center of the elevated stage sat the crown jewel of the evening. It was a massive, breathtakingly detailed three-dimensional scale model of the $2 billion waterfront project. The twin towers were illuminated from within by tiny LED lights, making the sweeping glass facades glow like beacons of absolute wealth. It was my design, my late nights, my endless calculations, my brilliant vision, sitting right there under the spotlight, waiting to be auctioned off by a family of thieves. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, casting a hush over the wealthy crowd. A bright spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the stage. Kendra walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtains, wearing a shimmering white gown that was specifically chosen to project pure, innocent brilliance. She grabbed the microphone with both hands, flashing a bright, practiced smile that she had perfected in front of her vanity mirror for weeks. She did not look toward the back of the room where I was standing in the shadows. She kept her eyes fixed strictly on the billionaires sitting in the front row. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Kendra began, her voice echoing softly through the state-of-the-art sound system. When I first conceptualized the waterfront project, I wanted to create more than just a commercial space. I wanted to create a living, breathing monument to the city of Atlanta. She swept her hand dramatically toward the glowing scale model, taking absolute credit for every single curve of steel and every pane of glass. She spoke about the emotional inspiration behind the flowing lines of the buildings, using shallow, meaningless buzzwords that she had memorized from architectural magazines. She talked about harmonizing with the river basin and capturing the spirit of the community. She completely omitted any mention of structural engineering because she did not know the first thing about it. She was selling a feeling because she could not sell the math. The audience of wealthy developers and hedge fund managers ate it up. They nodded along, mesmerized by her pretty face and her confident delivery, completely unaware that they were being charmed by an absolute fraud. The applause that followed her speech was deafening, rolling across the ballroom like a wave of pure validation. Kendra closed her eyes and soaked it in, basking in the stolen glory that rightfully belonged to me. After the applause finally died down, the event moderator stepped up to the podium and announced that the floor was now open for a brief question and answer session. This was a standard formality for investment galas, a chance for the major financial backers to ask surface-level questions before signing the massive term sheets. The first few questions were entirely predictable. An older white investor asked about the expected timeline for the commercial retail leases. Another developer asked about the aesthetic choices for the rooftop gardens. Kendra answered them easily, reciting the pre-rehearsed talking points that Brad had undoubtedly drilled into her head for the past month. I glanced toward the side entrance and saw my father, Desmond, and Brad finally slipping back into the ballroom. Their faces were still pale and tight with lingering panic from our confrontation in the hallway, but they were forcing themselves to project calm authority. They took their places near the edge of the stage, keeping a terrified, watchful eye on my position in the back. They were praying I would just stand there and watch. They were hoping their nightmare was over. It was not over. The moderator asked if there were any final questions before the official signing ceremony began. I stepped out from the shadows of the crowd and walked directly into the center aisle, where a tall silver microphone stand had been set up for the audience. My security guards moved with me, forming a protective semicircle that kept the murmuring guests at a safe distance. The emerald silk of my gown rustled softly against the carpet as I grasped the cool metal of the microphone stand. The spotlight shifted slightly, catching the defiant angle of my chin and the cold, unyielding focus in my eyes. The entire ballroom went dead silent as they recognized the woman who had caused the massive disruption earlier in the evening. On the stage, Kendra clutched her microphone so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. Her practiced smile shattered, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror as she realized exactly what was about to happen. I leaned into the microphone and my voice rang out, crystal clear and razor-sharp, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Good evening, Kendra," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and professionally lethal. "The conceptual aesthetic of the Twin Towers is certainly beautiful. However, as the lead architect, you must be intimately familiar with the foundational mechanics required to support such an ambitious cantilevered structure. My question pertains to the geological realities of the Atlanta River Basin." I paused, letting the heavy tension stretch out across the room before delivering the fatal blow. Given the highly saturated soil composition and the microsubsidence naturally occurring near that specific curve of the river, how exactly have you calculated the aerodynamic drag coefficient against the asymmetrical load of the deep pile foundations? Specifically, what is your exact mathematical contingency plan when the wind shear force acting on your massive glass facades causes the central pillars of the eastern tower to buckle under the uneven pressure within the first 36 months of construction? The absolute silence that followed my question was heavy enough to crush bone. It was a highly technical, incredibly complex engineering inquiry that any legitimate lead architect responsible for a $2 billion skyscraper would be able to answer without a second thought. It was the exact same structural flaw I had mapped out on Mr. Sterling Glass whiteboard days ago. But Kendra was not an architect. She was a thief who had traced over my drawings without understanding the physics holding them up. Kendra stood frozen in the center of the bright stage, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes like an animal caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down the side of her perfectly contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked wildly toward the side of the stage, silently begging Desmond and Brad to save her from the intellectual slaughter happening in front of a room full of billionaires. The wealthy investors sitting in the front row immediately sensed the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. These were ruthless men who protected their capital with lethal precision. They leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes narrowing with sudden dark suspicion. They began to whisper among themselves, pointing at the panicked, sweating woman on the stage who could not answer a basic structural safety question about the project she supposedly designed. The illusion of competence was rapidly bleeding out onto the stage floor, and the scent of blood was in the water. Brad saw the $2 billion term sheets slipping through his greedy fingers. His panic overrode his professional decorum entirely. He shoved past the event moderator and sprinted onto the stage, grabbing a spare microphone from a podium. He stood protectively in front of his frozen wife, trying to project a shield of arrogant corporate authority to calm the restless investors. "Excuse me!" Brad barked into the microphone, his voice booming too loudly and betraying his intense desperation. "This is an inappropriate time for granular technical interrogations. Tonight is a celebration of vision and community partnership, not an engineering seminar. The structural details have all been thoroughly vetted by our internal teams and the City Planning Commission. The woman asking this question is a disgruntled former employee who is actively trying to disrupt this private event with baseless hypothetical scenarios. We will not entertain this disruption any further." I did not move an inch away from the microphone. I stared right past Brad's pathetic attempt to deflect and locked my eyes back onto my trembling sister. The investors were no longer just whispering. They were openly demanding an answer. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point, and no amount of corporate double talk from an arrogant financial officer was going to force these wealthy developers to ignore a fatal flaw in a $2 billion investment. The trap had finally snapped shut around them, and they were completely suffocating under the bright stage lights. I did not step away from the microphone, and I did not let Brad's arrogant dismissal push me back into the shadows. The wealthy investors sitting in the front row were no longer polite guests at a high society gala. They were sharks who suddenly realized they were being fed poisoned bait. An older man with silver hair sitting directly in front of the stage slammed his crystal glass down onto the table with a sharp crack that cut through Brad's pathetic excuses. The investor demanded that Kendra answer the question, warning Brad that if they were expected to write checks for $2 billion, they needed to hear the lead architect explain the foundational load-bearing contingency plan immediately. Brad swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously against his tight silk collar. He looked at the angry billionaires and then looked back at Kendra, who was literally shaking behind the podium. She was gripping the edges of the wooden stand so tightly, her fingers looked completely bloodless. She opened her mouth to speak, but she only let out a ragged, desperate breath. The brilliant, visionary facade she had worn for 3 years was melting off her face under the scorching heat of the stage lights. My father Desmond stood paralyzed near the edge of the stage, his eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing that his golden child was completely incapable of saving his empire. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for another 10 seconds, allowing the entire ballroom to witness Kendra's total intellectual collapse. And then I reached into the sleek hidden pocket of my emerald silk gown and pulled out my smartphone. Mr. Sterling, a light information technology team, had been preparing for this exact moment for the last 48 hours. They had covertly accessed the hotel's secure audio-visual network, mapping the exact routing protocols of the massive smart projectors suspended from the ballroom vaulted ceiling. They had given my phone master override access to the entire display system. I did not need permission to share my screen, and I did not need Brad approval to present my evidence to the world. I tapped a single command on my glowing screen. Instantly, the massive digital displays behind the stage, which had been showing a beautiful rotating animation of the fake waterfront project, flickered wildly. The smooth corporate marketing video vanished, replaced by a stark black screen. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded ballroom as the sudden change in lighting cast dark, sharp shadows across the faces of my terrified family members. Brad spun around to look at the screen, his mouth falling open in shock. Kendra stumbled backward away from the podium, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as the true nightmare began to unfold right behind her. I lifted my head and spoke clearly into the microphone, my voice echoing with absolute, undeniable authority. "You cannot answer the question, Kendra," I said, staring directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes, "because you do not know the first thing about structural engineering. You cannot explain the localized soil subsidence or the aerodynamic drag coefficient because you never actually did the math. You are standing on that stage trying to claim a $2 billion legacy that you did absolutely nothing to earn." I swiped my finger across my phone screen. The massive projectors hummed loudly as they displayed a highly complex architectural drafting file onto the screens behind the stage. It was a raw, unedited computer-aided design file filled with thousands of intricate blue lines, geometric grids, and dense structural calculations. The investors in the front row leaned forward collectively, recognizing the authentic raw data of a legitimate architectural blueprint. "These are the original foundation mattresses and load-bearing calculations for the waterfront twin towers," I announced, my voice projecting over the stunned murmurs of the wealthy crowd. "I created these exact blueprints 3 years ago while sitting at my small desk in the house my father eventually threw me out of. I spent months calculating the wind shear forces and the tensile strength of the steel frame, ensuring that those massive glass facades would never buckle under the immense pressure of the river basin environment." I swiped my finger again, zooming in closely on the digital blueprints displayed on the massive screens, the image magnified, diving deep into the microscopic details of the central structural pillars of the eastern tower. The lines grew thicker and more defined, revealing the hidden layers of data embedded directly into the digital framework of the building. When my father fired me from the family firm and threw me onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back, I continued, never breaking eye contact with my trembling sister, he allowed you to confiscate my private hard drives, Kendra. He gave you unrestricted access to my intellectual property because he needed a golden child to parade in front of the City Planning Commission. He knew you were too lazy and incompetent to design a project of this magnitude yourself, so he let you steal my life work and stamp your name on it. But you were too arrogant to realize that true architects always protect their creations. I tapped the screen one final time, executing a command that decrypted the hidden data layers within the drafting file. On the massive screens behind the stage, the intricate blue lines of the central pillar suddenly shifted and rearranged themselves. Right there, embedded deep within the microcoding of the structural foundation, was a clear, undeniable cryptographic watermark. The letters glowed brightly on the screen for every single billionaire, developer, and politician in the room to read. ZEAI read the letters aloud, letting them echo through the silent ballroom. Zuri Elijah Architecture. Dated exactly 3 years ago. 6 full months before you even claimed to have conceptualized this project, Kendra. The ballroom erupted. The polite high society silence completely shattered as hundreds of guests gasped in absolute shock. The wealthy Wall Street investors began shouting furious questions at Brad, demanding to know why they were being pitched stolen intellectual property. The sheer magnitude of the corporate plagiarism was undeniable. The cryptographic watermark could not be faked, and the date stamp proved definitively that the design existed long before Kendra ever presented it to the board. On the stage, the illusion of the perfect, successful family finally collapsed into total, devastating ruin. Kendra let out a loud, broken sob and covered her face with her trembling hands. She burst into hysterical tears, the heavy makeup running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She collapsed against the wooden podium, unable to stand under the crushing weight of her public humiliation. The brilliant visionary architect, the pride of the family, the flawless golden child had just been exposed as a pathetic, fraudulent thief in front of the most powerful people in the entire state. Brad was frozen in place, his face alternating between chalky white and furious red. He looked at the massive screen displaying my initials and then looked down at his sobbing wife. He could not spin this. He could not use his arrogant corporate jargon to deflect a digital watermark embedded in the fundamental coding of the building. The investors he had been aggressively courting all night were currently looking at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. They realized he was not a brilliant financial officer securing a lucrative deal, but a desperate con man trying to peddle a stolen, defective design. Near the edge of the stage, my father Desmond looked as though he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. He stared up at the giant screen displaying the name of his own father Elijah, combined with my name Zuri. The very legacy he had tried so desperately to erase had just materialized on a 50-foot screen to destroy his crowning achievement. His chest heaved violently as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The catastrophic reality of his situation finally tearing through his massive ego. "You can cry all you want, Kendra," I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the room with chilling precision. "But your tears will not change the structural math, and they will not fix the defective foundation you are trying to build. You stole my genius because you have none of your own. You let me scrub dirty tables for 3 years, while you wore expensive silk dresses bought with my stolen potential. You looked at me tonight and told me I did not belong in this world. But the truth is, Kendra, you are the one who does not belong here. You are nothing but a hollow shadow trying to wear my crown." My mother Valerie, who had been hiding near the appetizer tables, let out a sharp, terrified wail. She pushed through the crowd and ran toward the stage, her silver gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. She tried to reach up and comfort her sobbing golden child, but the Wall Street investors physically blocked her path, demanding that Desmond explain the massive fraud playing out in front of them. The perfect affluent society image she valued more than her own soul was bleeding out on the ballroom carpet. Her country club friends were pulling out their phones, recording the total meltdown of the city's most untouchable family. I stood at the microphone stand, holding my phone in my hand, watching my family drown in the shallow waters of their own deceit. My elite security detail remained perfectly still, their stoic expressions contrasting with the wild panic erupting all around us. The string quartet had stopped playing long ago, leaving only the sounds of angry investors shouting and my sister's loud, pathetic sobs echoing through the room. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The terrifying father who had banished me, the arrogant brother-in-law who had thrown a shredded check in my face, the vain mother who had called me a bitter failure, and the treacherous sister who had stolen my future were all currently suffocating under the blinding light of the absolute truth. They had built a towering empire on a foundation of cruel lies, and I had just pulled the single critical pillar that brought the entire structure crashing down on their heads. But I was not finished. Exposing the stolen blueprints and destroying Kendra's fraudulent career was only the first phase of my grandfather's master plan. The absolute destruction of their professional reputation was deeply satisfying, but it was not the fatal blow. They still thought they could simply fire Kendra, apologize to the investors, and salvage the real estate deal by hiring a new architect. They still believed they owned the ground beneath their feet. They had absolutely no idea that the real nightmare was waiting patiently inside the heavy yellowed envelope I had left resting safely in my emerald evening bag. Desmond finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. His face turned a dark, violent shade of purple as absolute rage overtook his panic. He realized that his entire legacy was evaporating before his eyes, and his instinct was to attack the source of his ruin. He lunged forward, pushing past the angry hedge fund managers, and stormed toward the microphone stand where I stood. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face, his eyes burning with a manic, desperate hatred that I had not seen since the night he threw me out into the street. The ballroom held its breath, watching the most powerful real estate mogul in Atlanta march toward the daughter he had tried to erase. He thought he could intimidate me into silence. He thought his booming voice and aggressive physical presence would force me to shrink back into the shadows where he believed I belonged. But as he stomped down the center aisle looking like a wild, cornered animal, I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground, tightened my grip on the microphone, and waited for him to walk directly into the federal trap Mr. Sterling and I had so meticulously set for him. Desmond snapped. The carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, untouchable patriarch completely shattered under the blinding light of the projected watermark. He lunged across the stage, moving with a terrifying, chaotic aggression that knocked over a heavy wooden chair. He grabbed the microphone from Kendra, trembling hands wrenching it so violently that the cord whipped through the air. His face was a dark, mottled purple, the veins in his neck bulging as absolute panic drove him to extreme measures. He could see his entire $2 billion empire evaporating in the terrified eyes of the Wall Street investors sitting in the front row. He needed to silence me immediately, and he needed to destroy my credibility before the investors could process the massive digital proof glowing on the screens behind him. "Security!" he roared into the microphone, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Hotel security, get in here right now and remove this woman." He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at me, his chest heaving. He turned back to the investors, spreading his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Do not listen to a single word she says." He pleaded, his voice thick with manufactured outrage and terror. "She is not a legitimate architect. She is my estranged daughter, and she is clinically insane. She is a bitter, unstable college dropout who has been plotting against this family for years." He paced rapidly across the stage, the microphone picking up the ragged sound of his breathing. He was improvising desperately, throwing every lie he had ever constructed about me into the air, hoping something would stick. "She was fired from the family firm 3 years ago because she embezzled $500,000 from our corporate accounts. We covered it up to protect the family name, but she is a criminal. This entire stunt tonight is just an elaborate extortion attempt. She hacked our systems and planted that fake watermark just to ruin this gala because she is drowning in debt. She is a waitress who scrubs tables for minimum wage. Do not let a desperate con artist derail the greatest investment opportunity of the decade." The Wall Street executives murmured among themselves, clearly disturbed by the chaotic, unhinged display happening on the stage. They were ruthless men who dealt in facts, not family drama, but Desmond, desperate lies, planted a small seed of doubt. A few of the older developers looked from the glowing watermark back to my elegant emerald gown, trying to reconcile the image of a petty, embezzling waitress with the striking, confident woman standing in the center aisle. My mother Valerie grabbed the edge of the stage, her silver gown glittering under the lights as she added to the chaos. "She is sick," Valerie wailed, pointing at me with a trembling manicured finger. "My daughter needs psychiatric help. Someone please get her out of here before she hurts herself or ruins Kendra's brilliant career." Hotel security guards finally burst through the side doors, running down the aisles toward me. They were burly men wearing dark uniforms, responding to the frantic demands of the man who had rented the entire top floor. They pushed past the murmuring guests, their hands reaching out to grab my arms and physically drag me out of the ballroom. My elite sterling architecture security detail instantly tightened their formation, moving in front of me to form an impenetrable wall of broad shoulders and dark suits. The hotel guards stopped short, hesitating as they realized they were vastly outmatched by private professional contractors. "Get her out of here!" Desmond screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he slammed his hand against the podium. "Throw that crazy thief out into the street!" Before the hotel guards could take another step, or my detail could physically engage them, a sudden deafening sound cut through the chaos. The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom were thrown open with such immense force that they slammed loudly against the wood-paneled walls. The sharp, explosive noise echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing Desmond, frantic screaming, and halting the security guards in their tracks. The entire ballroom turned as one massive entity to look toward the entrance. Mr. Sterling walked through the doors. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He wore a dark, meticulously tailored power suit, his posture radiating the absolute unyielding authority of a man who controlled the very skyline of the city. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his dark eyes scanning the chaotic room and dismissing my father's frantic posturing in a single sweeping glance. He was not alone. Walking directly behind him, moving in a tight, synchronized formation, was a phalanx of 12 corporate lawyers. They were dressed in sharp, expensive suits, carrying heavy leather briefcases, and projecting an aura of lethal legal precision. They parted the sea of wealthy guests, like an incoming tide moving straight down the center aisle, to stand directly beside my security barrier. Desmond froze on the stage, the microphone hanging limply from his hand. His manic, aggressive energy completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming confusion. Sterling was his greatest rival, the chief executive officer of the largest and most successful architecture firm in the entire South. They despised each other. But Desmond's mind, corrupted by decades of greed and arrogance, could only process the world through the lens of transactional profit. As he watched Sterling walk down the aisle flanked by an army of lawyers, a new desperate narrative formed in his panicking brain. He actually believed that Sterling, seeing the massive potential of the waterfront project, had crashed the gala to offer a massive co-investment deal. He thought the appearance of the rival CEO was a miraculous lifeline meant to legitimize the project in front of the wary Wall Street investors. Sterling, my father, gasped, his voice suddenly smooth and slick, sliding back into his fake corporate persona. He straightened his velvet tuxedo and forced a wide, welcoming smile, trying desperately to ignore the fact that my grandfather's name was still glowing brightly on the 50-foot screens behind him. What an unexpected surprise. You picked a rather chaotic moment to arrive. But I imagine you saw the tremendous value of the waterfront development and decided you could not let these New York investors take all the equity. If you have come to offer a co-investment partnership, my team is more than willing to discuss a joint venture. Sterling did not smile. He did not return the fake pleasantries, and he did not look at my father with anything resembling professional respect. He walked right up to the microphone stand where I was standing, placing a steady, supportive hand on my shoulder. He looked out over the crowd of billionaires, developers, and politicians, and his voice cut through the silent ballroom with the cold, devastating precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I did not come here to invest in a fairy tale. Desmond," Mr. Sterling said, his voice low but carrying clear across the massive space. "And I certainly did not bring the most expensive litigation team in Atlanta to shake hands with a pathetic, delusional fraud." Desmond's smile cracked, completely falling off his face in jagged, ruined pieces. Valerie let out a quiet, whimpering gasp, stepping back from the stage. Brad, who had been hovering near Kendra, suddenly looked like he was going to be physically sick. He recognized the lead attorney standing next to Sterling, an older, ruthless litigator who specialized strictly in catastrophic corporate fraud cases. Mr. Sterling turned to the Wall Street investors sitting in the front row, addressing them directly. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "I strongly advise you to put your custom fountain pens away and step back from those term sheets. If you sign those investment documents tonight, you will not be securing a $2 billion real estate deal. You will be legally binding yourselves to the most spectacular federal crime this city has seen in a decade." The investors began shoving their chairs back, their expressions turning hard and aggressive. They were men who managed billions of dollars in pension funds and private equity. The mere mention of federal fraud by a highly respected CEO like Sterling was enough to completely detonate the deal. Desmond realized his final desperate attempt to save the project had just been violently crushed. "What are you talking about?" Desmond shouted, panic fully consuming his voice again. "This is sabotage. You are trying to ruin my project because you could not secure the city permits yourself. You are colluding with this crazy girl to destroy my family legacy." Mr. Sterling let out a short, bitter laugh. "Your family legacy died the night your father Elijah passed away, Desmond. You are just the parasite that has been feeding on the corpse ever since. And as for this incredible woman standing next to me," he gestured toward me, his eyes filled with immense respect. "She is not a crazy, bitter dropout. She is the newest full equal partner at Sterling Architecture. And she is the only legitimate visionary in this entire room." The ballroom erupted into shocked, chaotic whispers again. The revelation that the disgraced waitress' daughter was now a full partner at the most powerful rival firm in the city was a plot twist none of the high society guests could comprehend. Kendra let out another loud, pathetic sob, sinking down onto the stage floor, completely ruined by the realization that her brilliant sister had not just survived the exile, but had ascended to a throne Kendra could never even touch. "But we are not here to discuss architectural brilliance," Mr. Sterling continued, his voice rising over the noise of the crowd. "We are here to discuss a massive multi-million-dollar theft. You stood on that stage, Desmond, and publicly accused your daughter of embezzling $500,000 from your family firm. You called her a thief in front of the most powerful people in this state." Mr. Sterling turned and looked directly at me. The moment had arrived. The final fatal blow that my grandfather had meticulously prepared 12 years ago was ready to be delivered. I reached into the sleek hidden pocket of my emerald silk gown and closed my fingers around the thick legal documents waiting inside. I pulled them out, holding them tightly in my right hand as I stepped fully up to the microphone. My father was shaking violently, his eyes wide and terrified as he stared at the papers in my hand. He knew he was trapped, but he still did not understand the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the destruction I was about to unleash on his entire world. Mr. Sterling took a slow, deliberate step backward, lowering his hand from my shoulder. He turned his body, slightly angling himself so that I was the absolute, undeniable focal point of the entire grand ballroom. He lifted his chin in a gesture of profound respect, yielding the floor to me completely. The massive crowd of wealthy developers and elite politicians held their collective breath, waiting for the final execution. The silence in the room was so absolute you could hear the soft rustle of my emerald silk gown as I adjusted my grip on the cool metal of the microphone stand. I looked down at my father Desmond, who was standing near the edge of the stage, looking like a man who had just realized he was standing on a live landmine. "You stood on this stage just moments ago and told the most powerful investors in the state that I embezzled $500,000 from the family firm," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any mercy. "You told them I was a thief and a clinically insane dropout to discredit me and silence me before I could expose the rot at the core of your empire. You have been telling that exact same vicious lie to every architecture firm in Atlanta for the last 3 years, using your massive corporate influence to ensure I was blacklisted and starved out of the industry entirely." I lifted my left hand, holding up a thick stack of printed financial records, shaking them slightly so the harsh stage lights caught the bright red seals stamped across the pages. "These are not architectural blueprints, Desmond. These are the highly classified certified transfer logs from your personal offshore banking accounts located in the Cayman Islands. Desmond's face drained of whatever color it had left, turning a sickly ashen gray. He took a weak, stumbling step backward, his expensive custom velvet tuxedo suddenly looking much too large for his rapidly shrinking frame. His mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish. 3 years ago, the employee pension fund of the family firm suddenly came up short by exactly $500,000. I continued, my voice echoing loudly off the vaulted ceiling, slicing through the dead silence of the ballroom. You had made a series of reckless, disastrous investments, trying desperately to keep up with the billionaire developers you so deeply envied in your country club circles. When those pathetic investments failed, you quietly drained the retirement accounts of the loyal men and women who built your empire, laying bricks and pouring concrete just to cover your own massive losses. But I was working as an intern in the accounting department back then, and I noticed the glaring discrepancies in the ledger. The internal auditors were getting dangerously close to finding the missing money, and you knew I was putting the pieces together. You needed a scapegoat, and you needed one fast to avoid federal prison. So you framed the daughter who was already struggling with severe depression. You fabricated an elaborate paper trail pointing directly to my personal accounts, and then you violently threw me out of the house in the middle of the night, claiming to the board of directors that you were protecting the family honor by handling the matter privately instead of calling the police. You sacrificed your own child to the wolves just to hide your own spectacular greed. The grand ballroom erupted in a massive wave of furious, disgusted whispers. The elite members of high society who had previously admired Desmond as an untouchable pillar of black excellence were now looking at him with sheer absolute revulsion. Stealing from an employee pension fund was a cardinal sin in the corporate world, but framing your own struggling daughter for the crime, tossing her onto the street to face poverty and homelessness, was an act of such profound moral bankruptcy that it left the entire wealthy crowd physically sickened. Valerie, my mother, let out a small, pathetic gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling, manicured hands. She stared at Desmond, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the perfect, flawless reputation she worshipped more than God himself was currently burning to ash right in front of her country club friends. The illusion of their perfect, affluent family was completely dead. But that pathetic, cowardly theft is just pocket change compared to the spectacular federal fraud you are committing tonight, I said, lowering the bank statements and raising the heavy yellowed parchment I had pulled from my grandfather envelope. You invited the most ruthless Wall Street investors to this grand ballroom to sign term sheets for a $2 billion mega project. You asked them to pour their institutional capital into the waterfront development, promising them massive generational returns. You built this beautiful glowing scale model sitting on the stage, and you paraded my fraudulent sister around, claiming you hold the exclusive development rights to those 50 acres of prime riverfront property. I reached into my pocket with my free hand and tapped my smartphone screen, activating the master override for the hotel projection system once again. The massive screens behind the stage flickered briefly, dropping the cryptographic watermark and replacing it with a high-resolution scan of the legal document I was holding in my hand. The dense legal text glowed brightly under the stage lights, magnifying the unmistakable sweeping signature of my late grandfather Elijah at the very bottom of the page, along with the heavy crimson wax seal that verified its authenticity. "This is a legally binding, irrevocable deed of trust," I announced, pointing up at the massive screens. It was executed, notarized, and filed deep within a blind trust, exactly 12 years ago, by the original founder of this real estate dynasty. My grandfather Elijah was a brilliant visionary, but more importantly, he was a man who saw you for exactly who you are, Desmond. He knew you were a greedy, corrupt parasite who would eventually try to exploit his community legacy to feed your own massive ego. He knew you would try to sell out the very neighborhoods he built just to impress your wealthy white investors. So before he died, he quietly carved the most valuable piece of commercial real estate out of the corporate portfolio entirely. Desmond shook his head violently, his eyes darting frantically between the glowing legal document on the screen and the physical paper in my hand. "No." He rasped, his voice completely hoarse and broken, barely audible over the hum of the projectors. No, that is absolutely impossible. That land belongs to the firm. It is my land. I inherited everything when he died. I am the chief executive officer. You inherited the illusion of control, I corrected him sharply, my voice cutting through his pathetic denial like a serrated blade. You never owned the waterfront, Desmond. You just assumed you did, because you are far too arrogant and entitled to ever perform a proper legal title search on your own private personal holdings. Grandpa Elijah never left you that dirt. He placed the exclusive lifetime ownership of those 50 acres into an impenetrable blind trust, and he listed one single absolute beneficiary to hold the keys to the kingdom. I swiped my finger on my phone screen, zooming the projected image directly onto the beneficiary clause of the legal document. The black letters were massive, towering 50 feet high over the ruined scale model of the fake development project, casting a dark shadow over my father's face. Zuri, I read my own name aloud, letting it wash over the dead silent ballroom. My grandfather left the entire riverfront to me. I am the sole legal proprietor of the very ground you are trying to build your pathetic monument on. You do not own the waterfront, Desmond. You do not even own the dirt under the plastic model sitting on that stage. The absolute catastrophic reality of the situation hit the front row of Wall Street investors like a physical explosion. These were brilliant, ruthless men who managed billions of dollars for global equity funds and sovereign wealth portfolios. They instantly recognized the devastating legal implications of soliciting massive capital investments on a property the developer did not even legally own. Chairs scraped loudly and violently against the marble floor as several hedge fund managers immediately stood up, their faces dark with aggressive fury. They began aggressively shoving their expensive custom fountain pens back into their suit jackets, physically stepping away from the tables where the fraudulent term sheets were resting, as if the paper itself was toxic. Local politicians who had previously endorsed the project began backing away into the shadows, desperate to distance their political campaigns from the radioactive fallout of the massive scam. I did not let the chaos stop me from delivering the final blow. I turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto Brad, my arrogant, condescending white brother-in-law, who was currently hyperventilating near the edge of the stage. His face had drained of all color matching the crisp white tablecloths. The smug, superior smirk he had worn in the hallway when he threw the shredded pieces of that $10,000 check in my face had been completely annihilated. He looked like a man standing on the train tracks, watching a massive freight train hurtling directly toward his chest with absolutely nowhere to run. You should have paid much closer attention to the legal disclosures before you signed them, Brad, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal cadence that made him physically flinch. As the chief financial officer of the family firm, you were legally responsible for verifying the asset portfolios before drafting the investment prospectuses. You wanted the massive multi-million-dollar closing bonus so badly that you completely ignored standard due diligence. You personally signed off on every single financial document distributed to these wealthy institutional investors tonight. You used interstate electronic communications to solicit billions of dollars based on a deliberate material misrepresentation of asset ownership. Brad's legs completely gave out beneath him. He stumbled backward, hitting the heavy wooden podium and sliding down the side of it until his knees hit the hard stage floor. He gasped for air, his hands clutching his chest as a full-blown panic attack seized his entire nervous system. He was a high-level finance executive who knew the federal statutes inside and out. He knew exactly what I was describing, and he knew there was absolutely no legal defense for his gross negligence and complicity. Under federal law, I continued, refusing to look away from his terrified face. That is the textbook definition of felony wire fraud. You did not just make a simple administrative mistake. You and Desmond actively conspired to defraud major financial institutions out of $2 billion. The Security and Exchange Commission does not look kindly on massive corporate plagiarism combined with spectacular land fraud. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The grand ballroom completely dissolved into absolute unparalleled chaos. The wealthy investors in the front row did not just step away from the tables, They actively grabbed the thick stacks of $2 billion term sheets and began tearing them in half, throwing the ruined pieces of paper onto the expensive carpet. One of the lead investors, a ruthless New York billionaire, pointed a furious, shaking finger directly at Desmond, roaring that he was going to personally ensure the entire family firm was investigated by the FBI and stripped down to its very foundation. The investors demanded their coats and began storming toward the exit, completely disgusted by the monumental scam they had almost fallen victim to. On the stage, Kendra was sobbing so violently she was choking on her own breath. The pristine white gown she had worn to project her fake architectural brilliance was now stained with her own tears and the dark smudged ruins of her expensive makeup. She crawled across the stage floor toward Brad, grabbing the lapels of his tailored suit and begging him to fix it, to tell the angry men that it was just a misunderstanding. But Brad could not even form a coherent sentence. He was rocking back and forth, muttering endlessly about federal prison and ruined financial licenses. His entire privileged, comfortable life had been violently ripped away from him in the span of 10 minutes, leaving only the terrifying reality of a concrete cell. Valerie, my mother, finally broke completely. The illusion of the perfect high society matriarch shattered into microscopic pieces, leaving behind a terrified, pathetic woman who realized she was about to lose her country club memberships, her luxury cars, and her entire social standing. She let out a piercing, guttural scream and tried to run toward Desmond, but her high heels caught on the edge of the thick carpet and she stumbled, falling hard onto her knees. She did not even try to get back up. She just sat there on the floor of the grand ballroom, weeping hysterically as her wealthy friends pulled out their smartphones and ruthlessly recorded her spectacular public downfall. The same women she had spent years trying to impress were now actively documenting her total humiliation for the morning society blogs. Desmond was completely paralyzed. He stood in the exact same spot, staring blankly at the massive screen where my grandfather's signature glowed like a holy judgment. His shoulders slumped, and the aggressive, commanding posture he had maintained for decades simply evaporated into thin air. He looked incredibly small, broken, and entirely defeated. The massive $2 billion empire he had tried to build on the ashes of my ruined life had just collapsed, burying him under the catastrophic weight of his own relentless greed. Mr. Sterling stepped forward, moving to stand right beside me at the microphone. He looked out over the chaotic, ruined ballroom with a calm, satisfied expression. He turned to his lead corporate attorney, who was already typing rapidly on a secure tablet. The attorney caught Mr. Sterling's eye and gave a sharp, precise nod, confirming that the financial authorities and federal investigators had already been notified, with all the digital evidence transmitted directly to their secure servers. The trap was closed. There was no escape. Absolute chaos erupted across the massive space as the reality of the situation finally settled into the minds of everyone present. The sound of tearing paper suddenly ripped through the heavy air of the grand ballroom, cutting through the frantic sobbing of my sister. It was a sharp, violently satisfying sound. The wealthy Wall Street investors, the men who controlled billions of dollars in global capital and who did not tolerate being made fools of, were physically destroying the massive term sheets they had been so eager to sign just 20 minutes ago. They ripped the thick, customized contracts in half, and then in half again, throwing the ruined pieces of paper onto the expensive hotel carpet with absolute disgust. These men did not just walk away from bad deals, they eradicated them entirely to ensure no legal trace of their involvement remained. One of the lead developers, a man who had been laughing and drinking expensive scotch with my father all evening, leaned over the table and pointed a shaking finger directly at Desmond. He did not shout, but his voice carried the lethal, cold promise of corporate warfare, promising my father that the legal retaliation from his investment firm would hunt Desmond to the ends of the earth and strip him of every single asset he had ever owned. Brad was still collapsed against the side of the wooden podium, struggling to pull even a single breath of air into his burning lungs. The arrogant white executive who had confidently shoved a torn $10,000 check into my chest earlier that evening was now completely shattered. He was experiencing a massive, catastrophic panic attack as the reality of federal prison closed tightly around his throat. He clutched at the collar of his custom-tailored suit, desperately trying to loosen his expensive silk tie. His eyes darted wildly around the room, watching the billionaires march toward the exit doors. He knew exactly how the financial justice system worked. He knew that when institutional investors were defrauded, the federal authorities did not offer plea deals or lenient sentences to the executives who signed the paperwork. They wanted blood, and Brad, as the chief financial officer who signed every single fraudulent document, was going to be the absolute first person they threw into a concrete cell to rot for the next 20 years. His entire privileged life, his country club memberships, his luxury cars, and his untouchable corporate status were completely dead, and he was suffocating under the weight of his own monumental greed. And then a new sound pierced through the chaotic noise of the crumbling gala. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, echoing through the busy streets of downtown Atlanta. The sound grew louder and more urgent with every passing second, completely cutting through the angry shouts of the departing guests and the pathetic whimpering of my ruined family. The sharp flashing reflections of red and blue emergency lights began to bounce aggressively against the massive arched windows of the grand ballroom, casting frantic, twisting shadows across the elegant gold leaf crown molding. Mr. Sterling, lead corporate attorney, adjusted his glasses and checked his sleek silver watch. His timing was absolutely impeccable. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom, the same doors I had walked through to deliver my grandfather justice, swung open for the final time tonight. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with the FBI letters printed boldly across the back strode into the room, moving with rapid, overwhelming authority. They were flanked by a heavy contingent of local Atlanta police officers who immediately spread out to secure every single exit in the ballroom, ensuring no one could slip away in the confusion. The remaining high society guests, the wealthy socialites and powerful politicians who had stayed to watch the drama unfold, instantly fell dead silent and backed away against the walls, desperate to avoid being caught in the blast radius of the massive federal raid. The agents did not hesitate or ask for directions. They had already received the mountain of digital evidence, the encrypted bank logs, the forged property deeds, and the stolen architectural blueprints that Mr. Sterling elite legal team had transmitted directly to their secure servers moments ago. They marched straight down the center aisle, moving with lethal, unwavering purpose directly toward the stage where my father and my brother-in-law were frozen in sheer terror. As the federal agents approached the podium, drawing their heavy metal handcuffs from their tactical belts, my mother Valerie finally snapped out of her paralyzed state on the floor. The ultimate nightmare of every high society matriarch was unfolding right in front of her country club friends and the flashing cameras of the local press. Her husband and her son-in-law were about to be publicly walked out of a luxury hotel in chains. She scrambled frantically across the plush carpet, her expensive silver designer gown tangling around her trembling legs. She did not run to Desmond, and she did not run to Brad. She ran directly to me. Valerie threw herself at my feet, grabbing desperately at the heavy emerald silk fabric of my custom gown. Her perfectly styled hair was a ruined mess, and her face was streaked with dark running makeup. "Zuri, please," she wailed, her voice cracking with absolute frantic desperation. "Zuri, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it is all a terrible misunderstanding. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot let them take your father and your brother-in-law away in handcuffs. Have mercy on us, Zuri, please have mercy." Right beside her, Kendra was still on her knees, weeping so violently her entire body shook. The sister who had happily stolen my intellectual property and paraded my genius as her own was completely, utterly broken. "My life is ruined," Kendra sobbed, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "My career is gone. They are going to take my architectural license. My husband is going to federal prison, and I am going to lose everything. Please, Zuri, I am so sorry. I am so sorry I took your designs. Just tell the agents to stop, please, I am begging you." I looked down at the two women groveling on the floor at my feet. I looked at the mother who had watched my father violently throw me out into the cold street 3 years ago without shedding a single tear. I looked at the sister who had gladly stepped over my ruined life to claim a fake $2 billion legacy because she was too lazy and incompetent to do the work herself. They were begging for mercy from the very same daughter they had mercilessly starved and humiliated. They thought the sacred bond of family would somehow magically save them now that they had absolutely nothing left to offer. They thought they could appeal to my heart after they had spent my entire life trying to rip it out of my chest. My face remained entirely, completely devoid of any emotion. I did not feel a single ounce of pity, a single shred of guilt, or a single drop of sorrow. My heart beat with a slow, steady, icy calm that radiated through my entire body. I looked down at my mother, hands clutching desperately at the beautiful fabric of my emerald dress, wrinkling the silk that I had earned with my own blood and sweat. Moving with slow, deliberate precision, I reached down and firmly grabbed her trembling wrists. I physically pried her fingers off my gown, dropping her hands back down toward the floor where she belonged. "You stopped being my family the night you watched me get thrown onto the street," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and carrying absolute finality. "You stood by and watched while the man you call my husband called every architecture firm in this city to ensure I was blacklisted and starved. You let me scrub dirty tables for 3 years while you wore expensive jewelry bought with my stolen potential and paraded my sister around as a prodigy. You did not care about blood or mercy when you told me I was a bitter failure who did not belong in your perfect affluent world. You left a $5 tip and a napkin, telling me to serve tables for the rest of my life. My grandfather was the only real family I ever had. He saw exactly who you all were, and he just served his justice from beyond the grave." Valerie let out a loud, agonizing wail, collapsing fully onto the ballroom floor, wrapping her arms around her head, as the absolute devastating reality of my words destroyed her final hope. She knew she had pushed me too far, and there was absolutely no coming back from the damage she had done. Kendra just buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the carpet, mourning the loss of the fake, glorious life she had stolen from me. I turned my back on them completely, severing the toxic tether that had bound me to their cruelty for my entire life. I walked away from their tears, because their tears meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. Behind me, the sharp, heavy click of metal handcuffs echoed loudly across the stage, cutting through the sound of the crying women. The federal agents had pulled Brad up from the floor, roughly pulling his arms behind his back and locking the steel cuffs tight around his wrists. He was openly weeping now, the arrogant white executive reduced to a pathetic, trembling shell, as the agents formally advised him of the federal wire fraud and corporate espionage charges pending against him. Desmond offered no physical resistance at all. The powerful, untouchable real estate titan simply held his hands out, his dark eyes entirely vacant, staring blankly at nothing, as the cold metal snapped around his own wrists. His $2 billion empire, his legacy, his massive crushing ego, had all been reduced to a pair of silver handcuffs and an impending federal indictment. He had lost everything because he could not recognize the genius standing right in front of him. The agents gripped their arms firmly, leading Desmond and Brad down the steps of the stage and walking them straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The remaining members of the local press who had been invited to document the massive investment signing were now frantically snapping photos and recording videos of the spectacular high society arrests. The bright, blinding flashes of the cameras illuminated the absolute disgrace painted across my father's face as he was publicly walked through the crowd of his former peers. Every single wealthy developer and politician watched in stunned, silent judgment as the men they had respected just an hour ago were led away to face a lifetime behind concrete walls. They were paraded out the mahogany doors and into the flashing emergency lights of the street below, their reputations permanently destroyed and their freedom permanently revoked. I stood near the center aisle watching them disappear through the heavy doors, surrounded by the flashing red and blue lights, waiting outside the hotel. The oppressive heavy darkness that had haunted my life for the last 3 years finally lifted, completely replaced by the bright, limitless horizon of my new reality. I was the sole owner of the most valuable riverfront property in the city, and I was a full equal partner at the most prestigious firm in the state. I had not just survived the fire they threw me into, I had walked out of the flames and burned their entire forest to the ground. The land was mine, the legacy was mine, and the future was entirely mine to build. I turned my head and looked at Mr. Sterling, who was standing beside me with that same quiet, deeply satisfied smile resting on his face. The grand ballroom was still chaotic with whispering guests and packing reporters, but right here in this specific spot, there was nothing but perfect victorious calm. Irony has a beautiful way of presenting itself at the perfect moment. A hotel waiter wearing a crisp uniform cautiously walked past us, carrying a silver tray, holding two tall crystal flutes of vintage champagne that had been originally poured to celebrate my father, fraudulent victory. I reached out gracefully and took both crystal glasses from the silver tray. I turned back to Mr. Sterling and handed one of the flutes to the man who had helped me honor my grandfather's sacred promise. Mr. Sterling raised his glass, looking at me with immense, profound pride. To the future of Zuri Elijah architecture, he said, his voice carrying the deep, steady weight of a promise fulfilled. To the future, I replied, looking at the bright, beautiful empire waiting for me. We brought our glasses together. The delicate, sharp clink of the crystal rang out clear and sweet, cutting through the remaining noise of the ruined gala. Behind us, the cameras of the press flashed one final brilliant time, capturing the exact beautiful moment. I stood perfectly victorious, breathing in the sweet, clean air built firmly on the smoldering ashes of my toxic family-ruined empire. The greatest lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by people who try to break you down, even if they share your blood. When toxic family members project their greed onto you, the most powerful response is to silently build your own strength. You do not have to accept abuse disguised as loyalty. True family is built on respect, not manipulation. By protecting your boundaries and focusing on your goals, you will eventually build a life they can never touch. If you found power in this story, please hit like and subscribe for more empowering videos.